Good morning and welcome to this week's recruitment discussion with Jump. And this week it's a bit of a controversial one. Quality candidates are hard to find, but we're still chasing jobs. So if you're watching on YouTube, thanks very much. Please subscribe. If you're watching us live and joining us live, you can find all our previous webinars and plus loads of free training on our YouTube channel. So please subscribe. That's all we ask for from there. But before Dave harps on about Arsenal, we're going to get some stats out and really look at the stats. And the stat that we want to talk about is that Arsenal hasn't won the Premiership for 22 years, but that's not a stat that this webinar is going to really focus on.
But
First
it's
stat,
a
though.
true stat.
It is. First stat, nearly 75% of all employers worldwide cannot find the skilled talent they need. That number is up from 36%, which it was 10 years ago, to 75%. So it's massively doubled in the last 10 years. And the shortage is not structural. It's not seasonal. It is just because of what's happening in the market. And that came from Manpower Group's talent shortage survey in 2025. So we've got to start to think the bigger players are already addressing that. So why aren't we looking at that? Second stat, the time to hire is now taking longer than it has ever taken before. The UK average time to hire now is stretched just beyond the 8 weeks. It was up from 4.8 weeks in 2024. So in almost a year, 70% of, if it's increased by over 50%, and almost 70% of all internal recruiters say the recruitment is taking too long. That source came from Total Jobs and it came from Personnel Today. So think, if the reality of this is, if your clients that you're working with now, if you took a job spec on, let's say yesterday, it's already sitting open too long compared to the fees that you modeled it for, because you probably modeled it for 8.4 weeks. That's if you measure your fees in the time it takes and the time that you invest to fill those fees. Third stat, and here's where the reality really hits in 2026. 70% of the global workforce is passive talent, not actively hunting, not on job boards, not replying to emails, not open to work on LinkedIn. Only 30% of professionals are actively seeking a job at any given time. 80% of talent acquisition leaders say engaging the passive candidate marketplace will be the most important recruitment skill in the next 5 years. And the agencies that are currently own the passive marketplace own the placements. But most agencies are competing on the active job boards, on LinkedIn. Therefore, they're only competing in 30% of the market. This source came from LinkedIn Talent and how to recruit the passive market. So if you put it another way, if you're a contingent recruitment, your slice of the pie is 30%. If you are building a talent marketplace, your slice of the pie is 70%. The final stat, and the most interesting one, the most expensive number in recruitment in 2026. 20%, 27% of the UK employers have had new starters fail to turn up on day one. 26% of candidates have declined offers because of poor candidate experience along the way. And 86% of UK job seekers admit they have skipped interviews without notice because of their experience from the client and from the recruitment agency. So every one of those numbers is a placement that's walking away from us. So the agencies that treat candidates like an inventory are the ones that are really having problems. And that source came from multiple sources, and it was a report that I read from the PR crowd about UK ghosting. So that's the question in the next 45 minutes. Is the quality of candidates are hard to find, but why are we still chasing job? Dave, it's great to see you this week. It's great that you're not on the bus, okay? And it's great that you're
Good.
back from
Good news. That is good news.
It is, and it's great that you're back from celebrating Arsenal's Champions League last night. When I texted you about 11 o'clock, you suddenly disappeared and went off down to Arsenal to celebrate. But let's not talk football. Let's kick straight into the recruitment discussion. So, question one. 72% of employers globally cannot find skilled talent they need. The number has doubled in 10 years, as we've just said. So the market has flipped. From your work with recruitment leaders, have they, or when did they first see recruitment owners adjust to that? And honestly, how many have still not adjusted to it?
Well, I'll start off by answering the question by saying I promised my sons, who I was with at Arsenal last night at 4 in the morning, that I would start off the webinar wearing my scarf, but that I would take it off because we may need it for clips and things a bit later on. So it's on, and now it's gone off. But I would make another slightly related football concept. It's amazing what good talent can do when it's all put together and led the right way. So. In answer to the question, I think the market is very cyclical. There have been so many changes in the market. I was astounded by some of the stats that you read out, that 72% of global employers can't find the right talent. We do in recruitment, I think, a brilliant job at finding the right talent for our clients. But we know it's tough, and some of the times we would say, well, actually, it's at the employer end. It shouldn't take 8 weeks on average to find the right person, especially if less than 2 years ago it was taking 5 weeks. If you've got the right person and you've put them through the right process, you should be able to get them on board or get them starting as quickly as you possibly can, because that's what we need. So I think it is all down to agencies focusing on candidate experience, keeping the candidate warm, hand holding them through the whole process. And once it comes to the day of them starting, and I think a lot of recruitment leaders, the ones that I speak to certainly, are totally aware of that. The thing is, from an employer point of view, there are now more people involved in the hiring than ever before. It used to be, I've got the candidate, I'll speak to this person, this person has the authority to hire, and you hire them, mainly on permanent, and that can be contract as well. Now there's a lot more process, both technical process and interviewing and people process to go through, and that partly has slowed the process down because there's a fear of getting it wrong. And yet, as you say, even when we get it right, a lot of the candidates don't turn up. So I think it's just you've got to be completely on top of the candidate and make sure that the hiring person is the deciding person, and make sure that as a recruiter you're training your staff to all those angles that where things could go wrong.
Interesting. I was with a couple of clients last week and we had a similar discussion. And I said, if you're still operating in this type of market, and they said, well, what do you mean? So I said, right, okay, let's look at the data over the last 90 days. If more than 70% of your client calls are to open requirements that you've not filled, then you haven't adjusted. And that's not about using data, that's about opinion. So if you then add the UK fill rate is ranging between 20 and 30, depending on what you read. And when you add automation and AI into the process and truly understand your client's skill and pain point, it demonstrates why the process needs to change. So if you're hunting jobs that you're never going to fill, we should be hunting candidates that can fill the jobs that we know that we can fill, and then similar jobs. So if you looked at your CRM and counted the candidates added in the last 30 days who are proactively sourced for future client needs, not for your client needs today, but for future client needs, and then count the candidates that are added because you sourced them for a job, what you'll find is that a second number is probably 90% of the candidates you've added to the system. You're still running a business as if you are running it for clients, and yet our fill rate is still 20 to 30%. When actually, if you start to build a bank of clients, you'll start to stop working roles that aren't worth working, and you'll start to work roles that are worth working. So most of my clients, especially a small percentage of them in markets where they've adjusted, they're walking away from roles that they never fill. And it's not about the philosophy of walking away. They're writing to the clients and using data and reasons why they're walking away. And when they go to a client and they go with a candidate approach, not a spec client, they're suddenly finding their fill rate's gone from 20 to 30%, and most of their fill rates are plus 70%. So obviously there's something wrong. And I think most leaders have not adjusted because they're not aware of the shift. And awareness isn't about adjustment. Adjustment shows up in your weekly rhythm, your KPIs, your teams, and what you're doing. And most importantly, it shows up in your fill rate. And if your fill rate isn't growing and getting better, then it says you're just using old traditional contingency methods, and you're not looking at how you can actually service your clients and your candidates. And I think we've got to do that a lot better than we do at the moment. So yes, I think recruitment 101, the standard of recruitment, has now changed. And I think if you've got candidates and product that clients want, that gives you a massive advantage. And I don't think we've really understood that and how that works. Let's look at it in a different way. What's the real cost of recruitment for recruitment teams still chasing jobs in what we class as a candidate scarce market? And so give us the sort of things that you see, whether it's time burned, fees lost, dead requirements, etc., that you should ever take. Talk to me about, popular burnout or specifics in that line for what you're actually seeing for people chasing roles.
Well, I think the key one is if I'm on a sales floor, I still hear the excitement from the sales people. Look, I've got a new job. Yeah, and that's good because that's what we're about. We want to find people to place jobs, and that's a great thing. But I don't see that much of, right, let me analyze this job, and have a look and see, well, what is my chance of filling it? And therefore we are working on, in a lot of cases, we're still working on stale jobs. And I think it's appropriate to say there are also such things as bad clients. Clients that give us jobs doesn't make them a good client. It's someone who's looking for work. But if you're one of 5 agencies and the client's looking for 10 people, and it's a race to the bottom, as in who can find the first candidate, there's no selection, there's no retention. The value of what we do as recruiters is diminished somewhat because everybody's chasing for the same thing. I think the intelligent place to stop is have a look and think, hold on, what are my chances of filling this? If the average is 1 in 5, that still means 80% of the work that we're doing, we're not going to get filled. 50-50, clearly much better, or retained, clearly much better than that. So it then affects, to your point, Heidi, it affects motivation. It affects commission, it affects earnings, it affects culture. You want to be working with clients that respect and value what you do, that your team respect and value what you do, and you're seeing growth in those clients. And you have a relationship with those clients where you are an advisor as well as a recruiter. And if you can get those things right, then some of the stats that you put at the beginning, they kind of dissipate because you know that you're doing the right things, and sometimes you'll be successful, sometimes you finish second. But even with a second place candidate, you may be able to find her or him another job somewhere else. But just going into that mass of, I've got a job, I've got 10 jobs to work on, you can't fill 10 jobs. Unless you've got an amazing AI tool or an amazing amount of time. If you're working on 10 jobs in 10 roles in 10 different clients, yeah, that's too many to do it well if you really have a good engagement with the client.
It's interesting, again, a conversation that I've literally just had. I've driven down to Cambridge this morning and had a conversation with a client on the way down about clients pulling out of requirements and stopping requirements and things like that.
Yeah.
And people saying, well, it's such a, it's a candidate market. There's lots of candidates out there. When actually, if you pulled up your last 20 requirements and looked at what you filled, if you're in that sort of 20% to 30%, then you're still in that lottery of trying to fill roles. Okay. So you've got to look at the data. But when you start to look at the stats, and I've used these stats in the past, okay, the number of jobs are falling faster than we've ever seen before, but they're now still only at the level where they were in 2021.
Yeah, the pre-COVID,
pre-COVID. So it's just dropped another. I think it was 27,000. It's dropped this last month, but it's now at 2021 levels. Okay. However, what hasn't been said, and this is the thing that people aren't understanding, is that the number of employable people in the UK is dropping faster than the number of jobs are dropping. And because job boards are full of poor candidates, not the best ones, then that's still working. So if you think the birth rate has been falling since 1972, it's now its lowest ever, around about 600,000 per year, where in the late 60s, it was over 1 million people per year. People are retiring early. People are choosing not to work. Currently, for the first time in the UK, the deficit of the UK spending on welfare and what it collects in income tax is being outsourced what it generates from normal business. So the welfare sits at 333 billion. Income tax generated sits at 331 billion. That's a £2 billion deficit. So consequently, we're spending more on those receiving benefits or pensions than we're taking from people who are working. So it doesn't take long to work out that there is a huge candidate shortage. So the hidden cost is that candidate burn. So every brief that you don't fill, and you send candidates to clients, what you're teaching your clients and your candidates is that you're just a transactional firm, just throwing mud and hoping it sticks to the wall. So you've got to start to think, if you don't want to compete against 4 other agencies, you've got to start to think about the damage that each quarter does to you by just throwing CVs at those type of things. So I'd start to think about, building proper talent pools for what's going on. So the most expensive cost is let's look at your average billers. If they're working 6 to 7 dead roles out of every 10 roles, and only 3 to 4 quality ones and a 30% fill rate, then they're not growing. But if you can change your process and your outlook, and then say in 6 months' time, you flip that number to where they're working 6 and 7 quality roles or 3 or 4 dead ones, I can guarantee your billings will have increased, your employee satisfaction will have increased, your client satisfaction will have increased, your fill rate will have increased, and your ability to say no to bad clients is part and parcel of that. So I think all of those things are happening, but it's not a conversation that is enjoyable, because we're changing our business processes to people that we don't think pay the bills, as in candidates, when actually they are the catalyst to pay the bills, and that's what we've got to see. So if we move that question on, then agencies winning in 26 are the proactive, not reactive. They know what each client will hire in the next 6 to 12 months before those roles land. They've probably pre-built talent pools to match. Why is this discipline so rare in most of the recruitment markets when it comes to the commercial upside is obvious. And what is the work the owner has to do with their teams and with their clients to actually build quality talent pools?
And I think the answer to this, Howard, lies in both the question you've posed and the stats that you gave. And it comes down to, how do you define a key client? Is your key client defined by you as someone who we bill a lot with? We've got more contractors in this client, therefore it's a key client. Yeah, we 10% of our revenue is with this one client, therefore it's a key client. On that measure, of course it is. But for me, a key client is someone that you can have a workforce planning stroke advisory conversation with. So we did an exercise for one of our recruitment clients with their clients, and we asked them, the clients, the end clients, what percentage of jobs did you not fill that you advertised? And across 5 clients, it was 32%. So nearly a third of the jobs that advertised that went out to agencies weren't filled. So not only are you working on a 1 in 5 chance of filling the jobs, but a third of those aren't going to be filled anyway. And it's really important that as recruiters, as leaders, we can have that conversation with our recruitment clients to say, you need to be engaged with your clients on workforce planning, management, that sort of thing, and then define those as your key clients. And you know what? They may not be your biggest clients. And I think if you get that definition right, and then go to your biggest clients, and if you are having those conversations, that's fantastic. But if you're not, if you're just, say, 1 of 5 suppliers, but they're your biggest client and you have the most people, or you're placing the most people, try to get a more incisive understanding of what's going on with that client. How are those things, how are they developing? What are the projects they've got on? And I know that the very good recruiters out there do this. There's no question about that. but not everybody does. And it's a little bit of a hope. And, hope in this market is not the greatest strategy.
I think it's down to training and knowledge.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
if your conversations with your top clients stop at taking a brief or taking a role or what have you, then there's no strategic questions. What does your hiring plan look like for the next 3, 6, 12 months? And I think that's one of the questions that most consultants are scared to ask because they don't want to know. They only want to know what's in it for them today. And so I think clients now are starting to expect to be asked. So if you don't ask it with conviction, but you're not asking with knowledge, then that's the problem. So you should be knowing what their competitors are doing. You should be knowing what the footfall looks like in that marketplace, etc. If you don't know that, then there's a problem. But also, you should be thinking about what you know about your client. You should know your client's headcount. You should know their attrition rate. You should know what their projects look like that will affect headcount positively or negatively. And use that knowledge then to grade your client, educate your client so you know what you should be working at with that client. Otherwise, it's just a gamble. You're just
Yeah.
gambling that that client's going to grow or not. And then if you think about your billers, and I remember going through this with my guys in when I was at Computer People at my own business. If a biller couldn't name 10 clients with confidence that they were going to hire next month, then they didn't understand the market. Then we started to work on if you couldn't name 10 clients who will need headcount in the next 3 months, you don't know your market. You haven't got the intelligence. Then we start to think if you don't have a true forward pipeline telling us what your client's doing in the next 3, 6, 9, and 12 months, then you don't understand your client at all. And that discipline is rare. And that's about them pre-building talent pools that feels like, you know, I'm not going to get any immediate revenue from those talent pools. But once you start to build those talent pools and your clients start to come with to you because you've got product, then all of a sudden you're in a far better position. So how much can you affect today? And that's the question that I started to think about was how much can you affect today? Nothing because it goes very quickly. But how much can you affect in 3 months' time? How much can you affect in 6 months' time? So if you know what they're doing in 6 months' time, you can affect that market so much more than you can affect what's going on today. So I think your traditional KPIs are killing that discipline. And if you look at, say, I've got a client, great client, recruited a young lady from another client that worked with me, that I was working with by chance. Worked for them for 6 months. She then went to hand a notice in. But what she'd learned in the old client was you've got to build your client base and build what was going on. But because it was a completely different marketplace, because she wasn't seeing success straight away, she thought she was being unsuccessful. But when we looked at her forward pipeline for the
Yeah.
next
That's
6 months,
exactly it. Yeah. Yeah.
her forward pipeline was like 350 grand. She landed 210K of it in the following 6 months. But in that 6 month period, she was leaving. She was going because she wasn't being successful. And the manager was thinking exactly the same. It was only when we opened their eyes to that, he suddenly went, oh, yeah, forgot all about what we're forward planning. So I think most clients who, have not rewritten their KPI grid to look at forward planning and look at pre-building talent pools, that should be part of your KPI because then that behaviors follow what you measure. And if you're measuring the behaviors that start to lead to jobs, not in the next 3 or 4 weeks, but in the next 6, 12 months, then you've got a very different business in front of you. And I think that's what it's about. It's not about CV to interview ratio. It's about what talent pools have you got that can fill what your client needs, not today because you can't affect that much today, but in 3, 6, 12 months time, because you can affect that so much more.
Yeah.
So if we move that on then to most agencies have heard of, you talked about clients, they've heard of the most placeable candidate, okay, and the reverse market those candidates, and some do it well, some not so well, except from that point of view. From your experience, what does properly a most placeable candidate actually look like? And here's the hardest question: why do most owners know that they should be building talent pools and understand what a most placeable candidate looks like, but they're still not doing it?
Well, it's a timing thing, isn't it? It's a timing thing and an attitude thing. if you run a very fast-paced business where you've got to find people tomorrow, yeah, it's more difficult to build on the timing. If you're running a professional services businesses where you can plan a bit further along, then you've got a bit more time. But the way that recruiters are measured is how they behave. So if you are not giving your consultants time to build a future platform of excellent clients, then it's going to be very difficult for them to do that. The very, very articulate and intelligent ones will be doing that every time. But that's not true for everybody. So, if you need to build a platform, like you said, of that lady who did £210,000 worth of business, you said the stat earlier on, Howard, that 70% of people, of candidates aren't looking for a job. That's where that's where your next hires are going to be because everybody else is looking at the 30%. So you do need time to develop your niche. We've always said that if you can have a niche skill set among your offering to the client community, you're going to know the type of people. I can tell you to the client, the 76 people with those skills, of those 76, 45 are available in the next 3 weeks or the next 10 weeks or whatever the number is. If you can talk like that to your clients, you're going to command a better fee, you're going to command a better value, and you're going to be more instructive and more relational driven. So I guess what I'm saying is you need to understand what your clients are looking for, and then go out and find out where the candidates are, and find where the candidates are that aren't looking to move, and to be able to say to your boss, if this is how it works, look, I haven't done a deal this week, but I'll tell you what I've got in the pipeline. I've got these candidates becoming available over the next 6 months, and map it out, and I'm going to go to these clients with them, and you'll find success. So I think most placeable candidates, the most placeable candidates, and I know this from the search firm that I chair, they're not looking. Yeah. And that applies now across the board. It is a bit different when you're building a temp desk, when you've got to find 6 forklift truck drivers tomorrow or 10 warehouse people, but you can still build that out. You can still map your candidate market.
It's interesting. We talk about, how many clients have you got giving you jobs, today and in the future. We talk about building those future pipelines. What I started to do with my consultants was, okay, for every job that you can tell me that you've got on, can you now name 10 candidates that could fill those jobs? And that was when the mentality started to flip, that they suddenly started to mine candidates because they knew I was going to ask them, there's no point having a job if you haven't got candidates that can fill the job. So name me 10 candidates that could fill those jobs. So all of a sudden, we weren't then specking out CVs. We were sending CVs, very marked CVs, to clients that may had a role 3, 6, or 9 months later, knowing what that candidate market would look like. And that was contract and perm. It wasn't just perm work. So we start to think that if you think the recruitment process is now 6 to 8 weeks, you then put 4 weeks notice on top of that, or 12 weeks notice on that. The actual recruitment process, including that to get someone to start over the threshold, is 3 to 6 months. So if you start to think about today, that's November.
Yes.
So we've got to start to think about that forward pipeline. So if I'm taking a candidate to a client today for a job in September or November, depending on the notice period, then I'm negating all my competition because I'm already taking the client to the client and giving them the source that they need. So maybe we should be thinking about KPIs that look like that. And one of the reasons why I think owners fear that and consultants fear that, because their commission structure isn't modeled around that. It's modeled around filling roles. It's not about building talent pool to pitch to clients where they have the very best. So if you reward behavior, then that's the behavior that you get if you reward that type of behavior. So I think we've got to start to think about asking your team what the MPC actually looks like, and what are you doing to get your MPC across to your clients before your competitors do. So I think it's about putting the perfect candidate in front of the perfect client, not just specking a CV out to all and sundry. And I think the other reason that the MCP requires the consultant to back themselves is that most consultants are not trained to pitch a person. They're only trained to pitch a CV against a role. where pitching a person against nothing is quite a different conversation. So I think it's again another training need. So building a forward pipeline, and one of the biggest strategies to execution gap is you build that forward pipeline, but then you don't build the candidates to actually fulfill that pipeline. And that's the gap that people need to close. And that's the gap that we need to look at. And I think the reasons why we're not doing that is because we're not paid to do that. And we don't see the advantage of doing that because we see its revenue too far away. When actually, if you build that revenue now, if you build that revenue over the next 6 months, then every month that revenue starts coming in, even though it's from 6 months time. And so we're growing the process, but we're actually making the placements far earlier in the process, and therefore we're squeezing out our competition. Question then, and I wrote this question. I love this question. Niche reputation, content, candidate experience, advocacy, and community. They're 5 levers of what I call candidate magnetism. Which levers are recruitment owners weakest on across their client base, and which are they most likely to ignore?
And what a great word, candidate magnetism is. Magnets attract and stick. So I would say, have you engaged with your candidates and asked them what it is that they want? It's okay for us to say, we're going to give you a great candidate experience, but do you know from your candidate pool in whatever sector you operate, what it is that the candidates are expecting, what is really above and beyond what they've had before from either you or any of the other agencies? Because magnetism, it's got to work both ways. So I would start by asking the candidates. The one that are weakest is advocacy for me. As recruiters, I don't think we're very good at getting references from either our clients or our candidates where they say, you know what, I had a great experience with Dave or Howard or whoever. This is what he did for me. This is why it's really good. And use that as a case study. We're very good at getting case studies from clients. We're very good at case studies from, we've hired these people and these people in our business have done great stuff. I see a lot on LinkedIn, which I love, by the way, where we're honouring and rewarding our own staff. But I don't see much in the terms of advocacy with clients. And I think that's the thing that we're possibly weakest on. And in terms of ignoring, I think that the very good recruiters don't ignore any of these things. It's just that the day is so full of things to do to build profit, to grow our businesses, that sometimes we don't place as much attention on the things like advocacy that we would do. And a lot of, I guess, quite a few of the recruitment companies I know, I wouldn't say they've got a community. I would say they've got some form of engagement with their candidates, but there's not a community. Yeah, I work with a digital creative recruitment company who is absolutely brilliant at community, and it is one of their USPs. They have their candidates together, the candidates talk and engage with each other. They host roundtables. They're just a great company at doing that. And I'll give them a name because I think they deserve a shout out. A company called Futureheads. Really, really good at building candidate community, honoring their candidates, learning from their candidates, and they clearly have a very good placement ratio because of it.
Interesting. I'm going to go on to community because I think that's one of them. So I see the weakest lever across the industry is content.
Okay.
I think recruitment published the lowest volume of useful market opinion of any 40 billion pound industry in the UK.
Yeah, because we are the 5th biggest. On turnover, we are the 5th biggest sector in the UK. Engineering's number 6.
Yeah, so this is not a creative problem. I think it's a confident and culture problem.
Yeah.
We're not great. We're great at posting jobs, but we're poor at collating and then using the data to build a brand that influences the market. As a subject matter expert, a thought leader, we think content for LinkedIn and content for newsletters. But think about this webinar. Think about the content that I've had to find for this webinar. Think about the networking groups that you could then use that type of information, that content, networking webinars, and building areas of conversation for modern recruitment businesses. And I think that's the platform that our content should be displayed on, but we're not doing that. But when you talk about building communities, we start to think about their niche. And I think a niche, people think, oh, what niche are you in? I'm in IT. No, that's not a niche. That's a market. What's
Yeah,
your niche within
yeah,
IT?
yeah,
That's it. Okay. So if you're in their niche, you've got candidates and clients, then you should be, lots of recruitment agencies go to those events. Okay. But do we present at those events? Do we control the narrative of those events? No, because they're not our events. So we know recruitment agencies that build their own events and build community in those own events. And so their community is their candidates and their clients going to somewhere where someone is giving them market information, giving them dialogue about what's happening in the market, educating them. That's real community. And it's being inside the same room with your candidates and clients, and then being the subject matter expert, being the influencer, let's use that word, being the influencer in the marketplace.
yeah, yeah.
You know, so the biggest agencies have been doing that for quite some time. I remember, at CP back in the early 2000s, holding breakfast seminars, bringing specialists in, and having 50 to 100 businesses in there listening to what we say. I've got one client that started their own YouTube channel 6 months ago in their local market, talking about local market presence, etc. He's now getting loads of clients logging onto their YouTube channel to find out what's going on. And it's just him talking every fortnight about the marketplace and what's going on. So I think if you're not part of a community, then you're an outsider. And I think most recruiters are an outsider in their niche, but will protest that they are inside that niche when they're actually not.
Yeah, yeah,
And I
yeah,
think
yeah,
you mentioned it there. I think the other lever that owners overestimate themselves in is candidate experience. Almost every owner I work with thinks that theirs is above average, when statistically that can't be true. So you start to think, do we give our candidates the experience? Not an experience, the experience. And I think that's where the outside of the marketplace, which is where I think most recruitment agencies stand, is where we then lose our fees because we lose our position. We're not positioned inside the marketplace. That means that our clients and our candidates can ignore us, negotiate our fees, negotiate where they want to go because we're not inside the market, we're outside the market. And I think we've got to understand that and make sure that we get inside the market and not just hanging on the coattails of it. And I think
yeah.
recruitment agencies hang on the coattails. Question 6 then. Here's one of the most sort of owners don't see. From your outside view of dozens of recruitment agencies, what is the candidate side problem that recruitment agencies are systematically blind to in their own business? The things that they're convinced is not an issue, but when from the outside, it is a whole big issue.
Well, I think the basic premise for me, and this is a generalization, but I believe it to be true, is that recruitment owners run client businesses, not candidate businesses. I did an exercise a couple of years ago where we did like an away day to try to build the structure and strategy of a particular recruitment business. And the day started with me saying, we're not going to talk about clients. We're going to talk about candidates. And what do we need to know? And how do we need to develop that? And the thinking from that particular agency was, well, clients pay, but candidates don't. So therefore, all our attention is on clients. And it's then all managed particularly downwards. There's minimum viable communication. There's no templated touch points. There's ghosting after placement. You make the placement and you never speak to the candidate again. So we tried to look at it from, well, what can we do to enhance our candidate experience, and how would that then turn into more money? So I think it's just really important that we have a focus on the clients. What's their experience like? What do they want? How do they want to be spoken to? How do they want to be contacted? In the tech world, saying 100 candidate calls a day, for example, you try and get a tech candidate to answer a phone. That just doesn't happen. Yet we all use our phones clearly for everything we do. But I would say 95% of tech candidates don't answer their phone. So you've got to find another way of engaging with them. And the best way of starting that is having them in the room with you to talk to you as you run your business about what's the best experience.
I think that's an interesting comment because I'm going to sort of say the biggest blind spot that I see is what I class as candidate attrition. I think that's invisible.
Right. Okay.
Most owners count placements. They don't count the candidates who've silently left their network, left their community because of their experience was indifferent. That number is far bigger than the placements that we make every year. It's considerably bigger, but no one measures it. But in the main, we've paid for those candidates. At some point, we've engaged with those candidates. And because the role was not either right or they didn't fill the role, we then leave those candidates. So to me, then that's a below average experience. It's a poor experience. And because we don't engage properly with the vast majority of our database, think how many fees that we're missing. And I dare you to sort of look at your database and say, right, in the last month, how many candidates have I placed? How many candidates have I added to my database? Add the ones that you've added to your database and not placed, and then say, right, how much is that pipeline worth? That is a huge figure. And I think the second is fee tolerance. Owners tell me that their fees are fine because their clients accept them, but acceptance, not approval. Most clients are quietly noting your fees against alternatives. Okay. So if you've not had a fee review within 12 months, then potentially you might be leaking fees to somebody else. And that leaks core because your fill rate is poor, or your failure rate, put it that way, the other side of that ratio coin is greater. So if you've always got great product and you're constantly taking your product to the market because your product is scarce, guess what? Your product has value. When you start to think about any market, think about the market nowadays. Okay, stock market is fluctuating up and down because of the wars,
Yep.
etc., going on in the marketplace. What's not fluctuating? Gold and oil going up and up and up and up and up because they're really scarce products. Well, our candidates are just as scarce as those two products, but we're not charging more for our candidates. We're not charging more for our service because we don't see them as a product. So I think that deepens the blind spot, and owners think they spend their day on strategy when actually their diary tells them that we spend their day on operations dressed up as strategy. And I think we've got to sort of get our heads together and start to think what actually pays the bills. Because if your fill rate is 20 to 30%, just think of that 70% to 80%
Yeah.
time that you're wasting that you could be investing on something that will make you money. So,
Yes.
last question. As a recruitment owner is sat at their desk tomorrow morning, having watched this, what's that one thing that, what's that thing today that's meaningful changes to their candidate flow that they could do in the next 90 days that would have a difference to them?
And as a recruitment owner, I would say analyze how you treat your candidates. There's lots to do in recruitment. We know that. There's lots to do with cash flow, with liaising with the bank or with shareholders or with clients, whatever it is. But one thing from today, analyze your clients because how you treat your clients, tell how you treat your candidates tells sophisticated clients a huge amount about your judgment and about your brand. If a candidate has a poor experience with your firm, they carry that into their professional network. And in those specialist markets, those professional networks are so important. So I would take some time to analyze how, as a business, you work with your candidates and how you treat them and your expectation of them and them of you.
That's an interesting comment. And I'm going to sort of put, if it was me tomorrow, what I'd do, I'd spend 1 hour and I'd open my CRM and I'd list the 10 candidates that if I placed in the next 90 days would have a meaningful change to my business. Then I'd plan my week around trying to find those candidates a job. And that is what I would be looking at, is the 10 most placeable candidates. What can I do there? I'll be then sending personal messages to those candidates, not check-ins, but specific messages from you, not from your consultants, but from you, the owner. Been thinking about your team's growth plans for next year. Would you have 30 minutes to then have a strategic conversation over the next 2 weeks? So I'd be thinking, right, I could take candidates to those clients and what's going on. So I'm going to have client conversations about what they're looking for, but I'd find the 10 most placeable candidates and then start to approach clients that I know that I could place those candidates in and see what happens. And I think you'd probably place more of those 10, more than 2 of those 10 candidates, rather than flipping it and saying I'm placing 2 jobs that I place, and see what happens. And I think that's a very different sort of view set, that if you looked at your 10 most placeable candidates and placed 4 of them, that's very different than taking 10 jobs and only filling 2. And after a while, you'll get better and better at filling those candidates because you know what's going on.
Yeah, definitely.
Interesting, Dave, as always. So thank you very much for your time, ladies and gents. Thanks for your time. Next week, we're going to start a whole new series of webinars. So I've yet to decide on the topic. So if you want a certain topic, then feel free to drop me a line. As I say, if you're watching on YouTube, thanks very much. Feel free to subscribe and work from there and join the rest of our content on YouTube. Dave, thanks very much. Well done, Arsenal. Okay, not often I say that.
You stayed up, so you're in for a good season next season.
We stayed there, yeah. And next year, we will be challenging you because you'll be down the bottom from there. But ladies and gentlemen, thanks for your time, much appreciated, and we look forward to seeing you all again next week. Thanks for your time.
Take care, everybody. Have a good week.